everybody. Morning again. So we had Paul out here last year, and well, we could afford him to come back, not Damon John though. But I appreciate you coming out here. Your session was one of the highest rated sessions that we had last year, so appreciate you joining us again.
Thank you. That's very gratifying.
All right. Well, you know what? Why don't we start in a little bit of an obvious question, and that one is: do you feel like at this moment we are in a bubble? And yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, I mean, bubbles are always sort of hard to define when you're in them, but we have all the conditions for a bubble right now. And what, by that we can say is that we know that firms are over-investing in AI, particularly the tech firms. And the reason is they're in a race. They're in a race to see who's going to win, who's going to be the dominant technology 5 years from now. So if we look at as this happened in the 1990s, we saw firms doing this, and there was this circle and this lots of investment happening. And we didn't know who was going to win and who was going to lose. But I can tell you that I don't use Netscape today. And if you told me in 1997 that I was not going to be using Netscape today, I would have thought that was a strange concept. All right? So this overinvestment leads to leads to capital that's going to be stranded at some point. So at some point, this stuff that's being dumped in, some of this technology isn't going to work or isn't going to become the dominant technology, and it will become stranded. When that happens, those firms will fall away, and that's when the bubble pops, okay? So what we see right now is very indicative of that. What we don't know is whether these firms can adjust a little bit, take technologies and go out like this instead of going up into a single thread like we did in the 1990s. And that's what we'll be watching for.
I saw an amazing statistic the other day. It was that Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft, and Meta, their CapEx for this year is $361 billion. If you took $361 billion, you could buy the top 35 airlines in the world. Mm-hmm. So what happens? Do we have another year of $361 billion of CapEx next year as well? I mean, you know, we talked backstage a little bit about the economic impact of pumping $361 billion into the economy.
Yeah, I can't foresee not continuing on this path for a little while. And so this is so much money that it's actually keeping us out of a recession right now. If this wasn't happening, we would be in a recession because it is completely offsetting the damage being caused by the tariffs. All right. In fact, it's more than offsetting that. And so we know that all of these companies are racing. They're racing to try and be what's used on the desktop, use what's used on your cell phone, being what's used within corporate processes, and they have to win that race. If they don't win that race, they won't be here 20 years from now. So they have to spend that money right now. They have to spend it. And a lot of that's going into data centers, and we know data centers will be stranded technology when we get 10, 15 years out. This is not CapEx that's a 20 or 30 year long lifetime. We know that chips will use less power. We know that the technologies around AI are using less resources to give us the same outputs. And that's where a lot of the innovation will happen over the next 10 years. So we won't need quite as much of that infrastructure as we're building right now. But right now we need it, and we need it to try and win the race. So I see this next year is going to be just as strong as last year. And it's even more important when we think about we're now not only in a race between the different AI structures, but we're also in a race with other countries like China. So as we see the Chinese self-driving technology actually in many testing beating what Waymo is doing, it means that our companies have to be worried that there's a competitor that they're not even quite sure what they're doing is going to beat them. So they have to spend the money.
Well, let's talk about that then. So, we're not fighting a war with China, but you could almost explain it as we're having a technological war with China right now. And a lot of these companies are essentially at the forefront. So maybe talk about how technology is playing that role in our almost Cold War with China.
Yeah. So what's starting to happen in technology is what started to happen about 5 years ago in finance, is the world started to break into two factions. And so now if you want to do a financial transaction, there's a system that you can use in the West, and there's a system that you can use that's built around China, okay? And so there's two different ways to get transactions done, all right? What we're seeing right now in technology is because we're using technology as a weapon, saying you can't use this, you can't have that, back and forth, each side is independently developing all the resources to do this. That's highly inefficient, but what it will do is lead to faster development, because that competition, that head-to-head competition, will force each side to go faster than they would have done without that competition. In economics, we call that north-south trade, and it's well documented for us that if you have this sort of technological competition happening, it speeds things up. And in this case, what's really cool is that we're having an entire set of researchers in China that we don't know what they're doing. And therefore, we're scared about that. And when you're scared, you dump even more money into trying to get further ahead.
So if you look into that crystal ball you have, I'm sure it's at your office, and you look at, the future of that relationship between ourselves and China and that competition in technologies, you look a few years down the road, what do you see?
I see, what I perceive will likely happen is that in the West we will have a few winners, and in the East they will have a few winners, and that the ability to monetize this is going to be hampered by the fact that we have to compete with these players from another country, all right? So if I want to sell to India, they now have 4 or 5 competitors to buy from, whereas if you're buying in the United States, you have 2. It's going to change cost structures depending on where you buy, and it's going to change the ability to have margin where you want it.
Where do you think that we are? So we're in this competition with China. So how do we best set ourselves up for this competition? Like, are there things that we're doing today that are hampering our efforts, and are we doing other things that are really helping those efforts in that technological war with China?
Well, one of the things that's very instinctive to do when you get into this type of competition is to turn inward. So you try very hard to say, this is mine, I'm not going to let you see it, I'm not going to work with you with it. And what we find is that when you do that, you slow down. That you actually have to open up. You actually have to take that risk and open up and work with other people in order to advance faster. And so what we're doing right now is watching companies very carefully. The more that they decide to go proprietary, pull stuff in, get out of the public eye to advance things, the more we know that they have a piece of technology that might be really good now, but they won't know how to advance it further because they aren't getting those good questions that you talked about earlier. They aren't getting that back and forth that happens. So even though we worry about spending money on something and then someone else stealing it, we find that under those conditions, not only do you grow faster, but the companies that are having stuff stolen often are better off in the end.
I'll change gears for a little bit. You're the head economist for Grand Valley. I think you meet with business leaders on a pretty regular basis. I'm assuming all different kinds of verticals and such. Are there 2 or 3 things that you're telling your leaders, like, hey, be on the lookout for this, invest over here, think about this differently? What are those top 2 or 3 things you're telling leaders when you're meeting with them?
Yeah, we're letting them know that consumers are a little scared right now, and that the world has broken into 2 groups of consumers, those that have and those that have not. And you have to understand that 70% of the consumers are in that group that cannot, okay? The basic thing I have to remind people is you have to earn about $130,000 a year for your family to have a safety fund, all right? That means 70% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. That's something that corporate leaders have to be very, very well aware of, because it means that most of their profit margin right now is being driven by the top 30%, the people in this room, not the people who are sitting around town, okay? So that's one thing we're worried about. The second thing that we're worried about is how you use technology, okay? How you think about integrating it into your processes. What we know is what they're most worried about once you get out of the top tier companies, once you start getting down into those 250 and down companies, is they're most worried about the security of their data. They just have no idea how they're going to use AI and keep their data secure. So that's what they're worried about. What I'm worried about is that the case studies that they've all been told about on how to use AI is last mile. It's talking to the consumer, where the vast majority of the wealth of AI so far has been in behind the scenes improvements in procurement, in accounting, in internal processes. And so they're looking in the wrong place for those efficiencies right now. And so we're telling them, hey, you need to be talking to your advisors. You need to be talking to people about how this technology is being used. And what we're finding is the large companies aren't telling the smaller companies how they're using it, because they're worried about losing a competitive advantage. And that lack of flow of information is hurting the ability for AI to have the productivity gains that it could have right now.
One of the things you said a moment ago just kind of struck me, and I saw something recently. It was like the top 10% of Americans are doing 50 or 60% of the spending. You use the top 30%, so I'm assuming maybe that's even 75, 80% of all consumption. Does that then mean that since they're doing all the spending, that the offerings that organizations like these folks are coming from, like they're going to start tailoring those offers more to essentially call it the top 10 to 30% of the United States?
Yeah. Because once you get out of the top 30%, people are intensely price sensitive right now, extremely price sensitive. If you look at fast food chains, the only ones that had massive growth this year are the ones who doubled down on decreasing prices, all right? And we're seeing that across the board. But up in that top 30%, they're not driven by income. They're not driven by what their paycheck is. They're driven by the value of their house and the value of their stock portfolio. And both of those have done very, very well. But it's very, very fragile because housing has gotten a little ahead of itself, and the stock market is being driven by that very narrow group of technology companies that is driving the economy. Because remember, we'd be in a recession if it weren't for those group doing all of this CapEx right now. And so all of that investment, all of that spending is getting sucked into a very narrow area of our economy. So our stock market's more fragile, our housing is more fragile, and the top 30% doesn't quite see it because everything has been good.
Yeah, you said something to me backstage about you think that if you took literally the top 4 CapEx spenders out of the economy, we're in a recession.
Yes.
All
we'd have to do is take those 4 out. We're barely growing at 2% right now. The 4 of them are over $350 billion in CapEx, let alone all the other spending that they're doing, all right? That's more than 1% of GDP. If all of a sudden they stopped spending that, we would be below 1% GDP growth. We would be in a recession. Right now, we are in a recession in certain corners of the economy, just not others. And this is the one that you all work in is one of those sectors that is doing quite well right now and isn't in that recession. So when I talk about a recession, people always think back to the last recessions, okay? And so if we leave out COVID, they're remembering the Great Recession, which was broad-based across everything, right? This is more like a 2001 recession, where it's narrow, and certain sectors of the economy are being hit and others aren't. But I want to remind you that if you lending money, we're seeing right now for people under the age of 45, so you just escaped that, all right? All right, so under the age of 45, that they are getting late on their car loans at the same rate as 2009, which is the Great Recession, all right? The consumer is really, really stressed right now, but it's being hidden, it's being papered over by all of this spending in AI right now that's occurring in our economy.
So those companies you talked about, I find something interesting. So like, let's talk about like OpenAI for a moment. So early on, it was a whole bunch of private equity. It was just continually feeding more money into that. And then I don't know if that market got exhausted, but at a moment in time, you started to then see technology companies doing circular deals, circular financing. It seems like, you know, NVIDIA, OpenAI, Oracle, Microsoft, all of them are almost they're making their own investments, and just, I don't know, there's some circular funding that's not stuff you see every day. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, we saw it in the 1990s, so
that's really refreshing.
We do have an example. It's created its own ecosystem. It's created its own environment, and it's independent of everything else that's going on. And in some ways, it's sort of interesting because when the press is worried about AI, who do they go talk to? The leaders of those 4 companies. And those 4 companies have a vested interest in the fact that we need to use this, or they can't build the chips and the technology and the data centers, all right? And so there's also what we would call an endogeneity problem in that there's self-fulfilling, I need to say how awesome this is and oversell it because I need to sell more of this stuff in order to keep this flow going. And they're all in on it, and they all want that to happen, okay? So what do we see? We see at some point they need to start monetizing this, and they haven't been able to monetize it effectively at this point. They're not making enough money compared to what they're spending. You can only do that so long. And so we're seeing that cycle sort of cycle down as we go through the next 5 years. When that cycle breaks, I don't know, all right? If it breaks, I don't know. But I do know that there's plenty of money there now for the next 12 months. So I'm really not worried about the near term. It's the midterm that we're worried about.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I'll tell you what, we'll get into 2026 predictions a little bit, and that gives me a little bit of a sneak preview as to what that could be. So, you know, we talked about how AI, you know, maybe we all think about it more for the front end, you know, customer service, when you're saying, hey, maybe focus a little bit more on the back end, but that has its costs to a certain extent as well.
Yep.
And one of the things I have here is from 2018 to today, Amazon went from 400,000 employees to 1.2 million. So in a matter of about 7 years, they tripled their workforce. Now a memo comes out and says, we're going to need approximately 600,000 less jobs over the next 10 years because of AI and because of this super advanced automation. I don't know, like this just, you know kind of messes with me? I was talking about my daughter earlier, and I don't know what I'm telling her to do for a living. You know, like I feel like everybody in this room, it's like, I want to be this, I want to be that. And there is this assumption that that job is going to be there in 10 or 20 years or so. So I just realized I've been talking for a long time. So I guess the question I have for you then is like, what is that job for the future?
Yeah, and the answer is no one knows, right?
Thanks.
You know, I have a 14-year-old son, so we're much tighter in on this than what you're seeing. What we do know is that the firms are exaggerating how many jobs they're losing because of AI right now. They're using it as cover. People don't like to fire people. Did you notice it sort of sucks when you go in and say, you don't have a job anymore? It's why you do it over Zoom now, so that you don't have to see their eyes. So you don't like to do it. So you like to have somebody to blame other than yourself. And what that blame is right now is, well, there's AI, and we can use AI to replace people. In reality, what we have going on is they came out of COVID with too many people. In that big run-up of hiring in Amazon, they never spent time doing an optimization. So they obviously need a 10%, 15%, 20% correction in their headcount, all right? But they were too scared to do it. They were too scared to do it because you couldn't replace your workers for a while. So they held on to them. They held on to them really tight. And what we're seeing now is that they need that money to do something else. They need that money to invest in AI. They need that money to do other things. And so what they're saying is, we're going to do just the plain old restructuring that we've been doing for the last 80 years, where the pendulum took us to too many employees, and now we're going to do some cuts. We know we're going to go a little bit too far, but then when we come back, we're going to have those workers that we really need. All right? And that's what's happening right now. So it's sort of hard to see how many jobs are being lost specifically because of AI.
It does seem like that is like the catch-all for, hey, we let this number of folks go, and it seems like that is just a quick reaction. And whether that's true or not, I don't know, or maybe it's just a part of the natural culling that happens over time.
Well, it's a great boogeyman, okay? And it's one that the press readily believes. And you don't have to say, you know, I screwed up, I hired too many people. You know, remember, ego really leads to some bad decisions. And what they have now is an out. They can say, oh, look at this, AI. AI is costing jobs. It's costing jobs in programming. It's costing jobs in customer service. It's costing jobs in procurement. We're seeing that happen, and it's happening in real time. But its magnitude is a little less than what you would see if you were reading the news.
What would you tell the people in this room that are thinking about their own careers and how they can protect themselves, you know, from being replaced? Mm-hmm. You know, what kind of career advice, guidance would you give the folks in the room?
Yeah, the one thing that AI doesn't replace is curiosity. All right, it doesn't have that innate curiosity. It answers the questions. It's the expert. It doesn't have the ability to think through, oh, you said this over here would be really cool. So when I talk to students, I tell them not to focus on the job, that you need to focus on being able to get good at being curious about coming up with new things, about having that drive to start new functions, to get information, an information set in your brain that isn't in one column. You know, I have a physics degree. I have an economics degree. I've retrained multiple times in my life into different areas of research. What that does is it gives me the ability to synthesize information from many different places into one thing. Okay? AI does that, but it does it based on history. Curiosity creates new history. And that curiosity is what lets us move forward. If you're curious and you can build that into your job, you'll do much better. All right? But if you're doing tasks, your job is susceptible for going away. If you're doing tasks and you've been there long enough that you're paid a lot, your job will be going away. You need to get out of the task. You need to be getting into the strategy and the thinking processes, or you'll be in trouble.
And you know, this makes me think about, you know, opposite ends of like the employment spectrum. So you have kids coming right out of college, so that, those folks typically go into something that's very task-oriented, like get to learn the business. I shudder to think about the availability of those jobs in the future, but I take the opposite end of that then as well. Folks are at maybe the last 10 to 12 years of their career, and all of a sudden they're let go and they're told, hey, you have to go retool because the job that you had was less relevant. As you talk to both ends of this spectrum, what would you say to both of those folks?
So the young folks, what's happened is we've actually gotten rid of an entire rung of the corporate ladder, all right? So internships are disappearing, the research jobs, the dirty work. Corporations have forgotten something really important, that those really low efficiency jobs early in your career is actually what teaches you to be a critical thinker later in your career, because you have to know how everything works in order to get there. They've forgotten that. We haven't gotten to the point yet in this path, because we're so early, that we've figured out how to replace that. I can tell you, working at a college, we're trying very hard to replace that. We're thinking, what can we do to do this? Because if we do that, then we remain relevant, and we don't know whether we'll remain relevant going forward. If you're over 55 and you've lost your job, now it's much more dire. It's much more dire because the return on investment of retraining is about 8 years, okay? If you're 55, that means you're 63. How many people actually believe at the age of 63 that a corporation is going to give you a shot starting a new path within the corporation? So if you're at that point, now your option really is to become an entrepreneur, to take on a customer focused position. And remember, the people in this downsizing that are losing their jobs are managers. You need to double down on your content expert side, because AI doesn't make a content expert more efficient. What it does is it makes people who aren't content experts a little closer to a content expert, all right? It closes the gap between them. So when we do productivity studies, we found that strong programmers weren't any more efficient, that strong managers weren't any more efficient, that strong researchers weren't any more efficient. But people who were on the new end were saving 10 or 15 to 20% of their time, all right? So if you're on this side, get out of it, be preparing to be a content expert again, as opposed to a manager. Be preparing for the fact that that means you'll earn 20% less. And be preparing for the fact that you may have to completely retool, in which case you need to shift to being an entrepreneur, because there's not enough time to do it within the corporate structure.
So they need to be thinking in their job today, you're just almost constantly retraining, almost, maybe that proactive approach to, just preparing for that day when that thing does happen, and you either need to entirely shift or at least pivot heavily.
Yeah, and they know this instinctively. It's the reason why 95% of the people say they're using AI, but only 17% of the companies say they're using AI, that they're using AI to actually improve the production. All right, so what's going on there? There's an awful lot of fake AI use going on out there. Yeah, I use AI. See, I did this cool thing, or you said some window dressing around it. In reality, you're actually going to have to learn it, all right, and learn how to use it, because otherwise you lose that gap between you and somebody who's paid less, and then you lose your job, all right. And corporations have to get to the point where they realize not only are we having fewer we're lost a rung, but every year 1% fewer students graduate from high school for the next 10 years, all right? In actuality, we need the productivity enhancements that are coming from AI in order to actually keep doing just what we're doing today. It's actually a good thing. It's going to get rid of jobs, yes, but there's not going to be anybody to do those jobs. So we have to do this.
Speaking of the future, I want to give a shout out to my friend who saw your segment last year, and he pointed something out, and I think it's worthy of saying this year because it really hit me as soon as he said it. He said, if someone says that something is 5 to 10 years out, they have no clue when it's actually going to be out.
That's right.
That's just a ballpark swag.
Yeah. I mean, if I don't know when something's going to say, I'll say, 5, 10 years. And it's almost a knee-jerk reaction. You hear people say it. And once they say that, I just replace that with, we have no idea. All right? Because 5, 10 years, no one's going to remember you said that. Even if they pull it up on the internet and laugh about it, they're not going to hold you to it. So we know that. What we do know is where this path is taking us is someplace different than any of us think it's going. All right? And I said this last year as well. It's not the people in this room who will figure out where we're going. It's the people who will be in this room 10 years from now. All right? And they're in high school. And they're using these tools to play. They're using these tools every single day to try and figure out how to game the system. They have the time to do it. All of us go to work, and we work all day. And we don't have time to play. It's really important, if you want to learn something new, to play. And I watch my son with AI, and he plays with it. It's a toy. And he has fun. And then when he sees bad AI in his video games, he can say, they don't know what they're doing, all right? But when I watch coworkers use AI, they're always trying to go from point A to point B. It might do that, but if you try point A to point B, C, D, E, F, G, you'll actually find better ways to do things and different ways to do things. That's what's going to happen in the next 10 years. So the types of jobs 10 years from today are going to be completely different than the prognosticators are telling us they're going to be, because they don't know. If you were sitting in 1995 and said, what's my job going to look like in 2005 or 2015, almost every answer you gave would be wrong.
Yeah, I apologize to everyone in this room that I told to be a coder 10 years ago. Sorry. We've got about 12 minutes left. I want to take a quick little peek. Inflation was on everyone's minds a year ago. We have another year of data under our belt since the last conversation. Mm-hmm. I'm curious how you've seen inflation over the last year, where you're seeing that going then as well. Because right. I mean that can topple governments. People change power because of inflation. Yep.
And what's funny is, at least in the United States, inflation hasn't been a story since the 1980s. Okay, and it's suddenly a story again, and no one knows how to deal with it because everybody who had to deal with inflation before is dead or retired. Okay, inflation is set to stay stronger. Okay, we know that tariffs create inflation. But that inflation is transitory, and I use that lightly because it's been misused. But it's something that happens and then it's done. Once I increase the price of something 10%, the price is 10% more, and we're done. All right? What has happened, however, is it's changed people's expectations as to how prices will be changing. And so when we ask consumers what's going to happen to prices, their assumption about price increases are higher than they used to be. All right? What does that do? Number one, it increases the ability for firms to raise prices, and they will take advantage of that. Okay? The second thing it does is it makes workers ask for more money. And so that's where I've been watching very carefully, because that will tell me whether inflation is sticky or not. All right? And what I can tell you is union contracts are showing that their expectation for inflation, and they're building it into their labor contracts, is a percentage point to a percentage and a point and a half more than it has traditionally been in the last 20 years. So we should expect inflation is going to continue in that 3% range for the foreseeable future.
Based upon the policies that are in place today.
The policies that are in place today, the labor contracts that are already in place, all right, and consumers just believing that it's going to go up 3% a year anyways.
So their expectations, to a certain extent, it's almost like a self-perpetuating.
Yeah, prices are often very, very much self-fulfilling.
The other, I had a few other things in here as well. Do you believe that there are, so a lot of us here are from Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Chicago, kind of the Rust Belt. Are there certain sectors that you believe are going to be in a pretty good place for the next couple of years, and then others that are just going to have a rough go at it?
Well, it depends on whether you're talking profits or employment, because those are two different things. But what we do know is that for the last 2 years, automotive has taken it on the chin. And it's taken it on the chin because of regulatory uncertainty. What type of car do I build? Do I build a gasoline car or do I build an electric car? It actually depends very heavily on who's president. And so that back and forth, that whiplash, has led to them freezing their investments, not wanting to hire, slowing down development of new vehicles, falling behind where China is, all right? So automotive's not in a great place right now. And for those three states, you're still talking 1 in 6 jobs is either directly or indirectly related to automotive, all right? We still have healthcare. We'll be doing okay, probably, all right? It does not a great profit center, but it is a good employment sector, all right? There won't be a lot of profit. We know defense is going to do okay because the world has become more unstable. And an unstable world leads to people buying things to protect themselves. So we know that that's there. So we can see aerospace is probably going to do okay. And we know that right now, the Cold War is being fought over technology. And so not only will building of missiles and bullets do well, but building of technology and spending on technology and spending on those things will do well. And we've learned about our weaknesses recently, and so we expect mining to do very well in the next 5-year segment.
You know, one of the things that you just hit on a little while ago is, government policy having significant economic impacts, kind of shifts our resources, how we do taxing, how we do investments. We're just coming out of a government shutdown, and I'm kind of curious as to if you believe that the inability for our government to function well is going to have significant impacts on the economy, on the status of all these folks' jobs.
Yeah. Look, what the government does is set the playing field. Okay, so they set out the yard lines and the goalposts and say, okay, play the game. What is happening in government right now is there's an argument between the left and the right as to whether we should be playing football or basketball. Now, if I know I'm playing football, we might change between high school and college rules, or college rules, or we might require big cheese heads to be worn to protect you from concussions, okay? But those rules are easy to adjust to. We're still playing football. I still hire linemen. I still hire wide receivers. I still hire those types of things, okay? But if all of a sudden the next group gets in and we're now playing basketball, all those linemen that I hired are now useless because a 300-pound lineman doesn't play basketball very well, all right? And so what government is doing to us right now, between their inability to the two sides to come to some level of consensus, we don't need consensus on everything, but you need some level of collegiality and consensus so that we continue to play the same game, all right? And that's what they're not doing, and that's what's going to slow businesses down, because they're not sure how to invest for the future. It's not those individual. I've heard for years from, oh my gosh, government just slows us down with all their regulations and all of these things that we have to do and all of this paperwork. And I've never seen it in the data until this last 2 years. All right. And in the last 2 years, we can actually see that pendulum swing between populist conservative and populist progressive that we're getting in the United States right now. As that swing happens, it actually is affecting orders. It's actually affecting investment. It's actually affecting how businesses make choices. That's bad.
Does that hamper us in our fight against, theoretically?
Competition.
Competition as we compete against China, because that's an autocracy. That is centralized command and control, and there's not a lot of inconsistency because all those orders are essentially coming from here versus coming from entrepreneurs, from business and such. Does this level of inconsistency hamper us when you compare us to China then?
Yes, it substantially does. Now, the good news is that we still have competition and the ability for firms to compete against each other to figure out who wins. In China, they decide who's going to win. That's extremely efficient. And if they guess right, they are really, really powerful and a force that you can't catch up with. The good news is we've discovered that governments choose wrong a lot. And as a result, they have stranded assets in China right now around real estate, around data centers, around all sorts of different types of investment that they will never recoup their costs on. All right? And someday that will come home to roost. So yes, that is our weakness, but we also have a strength.
We've got about 3.5 minutes. There's two questions I want to get to. Not sure this is exactly the question for you, Dr. Isley, but you know what? We have decided to take a very hands-off approach to regulating AI. Mm-hmm. So it makes us more competitive versus like a Europe. I'm not familiar enough with how China is going to be regulating AI, but what is your thoughts as to how we're regulating AI today and what that impact we have on the economy is? Yeah,
well, it allows us to have faster development. The question is, does it lead us to a bad path? If we had some more regulations, could we avoid a bad path? So when the Dallas Fed studied this and said, how is AI going to affect the economy? Okay, they looked out and they saw, okay, the most probable thing is it's just going to add a few percent to our growth over the next 10 years. And so it just, instead of growing like this, we're going to grow like this. But then on the graph, there's a red one that does this and dives down, and a green one that does this and skies off, okay? And I'm sort of a sci-fi guy, so the green to me is the Star Trek solution, where technology is harnessed for the good of humanity, and we just become super good at really cool things, all right? Like being able to order filet mignon from a wall, all right? The other path is the Terminator path, all right? Where AI leads to society falling apart, okay? So the question is, can we trust that we are developing AI in such a way to avoid that red line? I'm not particularly worried about it, but you hear an awful lot of people who are much deeper into it who are more worried about it. So if that's the case, then we need government regulations around that. Otherwise, we are having a low probability risk of something that's really, really bad. And we all have to remember the Terminator came back from 2029, which is only a few years in our future. So
I'm waiting for Schwarzenegger to walk down these halls. So we've got 1 minute left. I want to throw the crystal ball in front of you. Mm-hmm. We did this last year for 2025. I'm curious if you had to summarize what you see in 2026 in a few lines, what you see.
Yeah, so I'm going to steal this from a really old movie that most of you probably haven't watched, Being There. If you haven't, it's probably not a good one to watch, but because it's really, really long. But it is Peter Sellers, all right? The winter is going to be very cold for most people. Not for you in the tech sector, but we're going to see a continued slowdown as we go through the winter, all right? But the summer is going to be much warmer. And as we head into the winter, into the summer, the tax benefits from the big, beautiful bill kick in. Interest rates will start to accelerate going down, particularly after Powell is no longer in charge of the Federal Reserve. Interest rates going down are going to break loose equity out of houses, and that's going to lead to spending. So we expect the summer is going to be much, much warmer. And if you're a political scientist and you're a skeptic, you might note that that's about 3 months before the midterms. So
it's funny how it works like that. Well, thank you, Dr. Paul Isley. Can I get a round of applause for Dr. Paul Isley? Thank you so much.